Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Urantia Book Science and History Study. Today, we have a very special guest, my good friend Halbert Katzen. Halbert is a longtime student of the Urantia papers, and he's done a lot of work in the community. He has two websites, UB The News and UB Annotated, where he studies the Urantia book from kind of a credibility, exploring the veracity of some of the papers, especially the scientific and historical concepts. He also was an admin for the Urantia Book Science and History Facebook group for many years, where I worked with him closely, and that's how I got to know him. And recently, he went to Georgia and did a presentation, and we're going to talk about that. The main topic of this conversation is going to be the Adam and Eve gene, I like to call it, MCPH1. And we're going to kind of go through that and some new information that he's uncovered. And this should be an exciting episode. Halbert, how you doing?
Good. Good to talk to you. And thanks for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for being here.
If I could, maybe just to clear up for people listening, ubthenews.com just forwards you to ubannotated.com. So UB The News was the first project I did regarding study aids and research, and it was focused on how new discoveries are catching up to the Urantia book. And then UB Annotated became just a broader, all things Urantian type of website, and UB The News became part of it and now redirects to that.
Awesome. So what, when did you start the first project, UB The News?
Well, the idea came to me towards the end of 2006, right around Jesus' birthday. So I guess sort of midsummer there, or late summer. And so by the beginning of 2007, I was on the road, with the project for 3 years. I traveled around and gave presentations and built up the reports and presented at study groups and any place that would have me, basically. And so that was a great experience for 3 years. And the project, continued to develop. But after 10 years, then in 2017, that's when I expanded it to UB Annotated and took on all kinds of other topical studies and related projects, like, for instance, etymologies. One of the things you can find on UB Annotated is not all the words have etymologies yet, but we're getting pretty close.
That's a fascinating study. I know you originally started working on that. I think it was with Chris Halverson.
Yeah, I tried as much as I could, to co-write reports when it seems there was good overlap with someone in the community who had an interest and expertise in a given area.
Awesome. So recently you did a little traveling.
Indeed. The work that I did, the website and everything, attracted the attention of someone in Georgia, a woman named Marina Gigiashvili, and she's been reading the Urantia book for a few decades, largely on her own. And she came across my work about 10 years ago, and so we've been Zooming. But within her country, there was no one there to talk to about it. About a year ago, she introduced the book to a fellow musician. She works for the National Orchestra, and he took a very sincere interest in the Urantia book. His name's Shota, and he's read it once and listened to it twice in the last year or so. So he's obviously been pretty voracious with it, and it was great to meet him. They were both wonderfully helpful on the visit there, and we set up a presentation that I did at the National Library. About 30 people showed up. They had a beautiful space that could be rented out and used. And so that for me, of course, was the real highlight of the whole trip, and it has created ripples that are continuing. I've just in the last few days been in touch with someone from Georgia, so it's all developing quite nicely that way.
Yeah.
And I will say, to your introductory point, certainly presenting the Adam and Eve report information with the more recent information that's come along that I've learned about recently, but comes from about 2019, definitely makes it all more powerful. We'll get into these details, but I haven't given a presentation like this in about 10 years. The last one was working with Byron Belitzos in the Bay Area. And in that presentation, it covered Adam and Eve. But so it's been, over 10 years, or right about that. And a lot's changed. Göbekli Tepe has come along a lot in the last 10 years as a point of interest for people, Urantia Book readers or non. And so it's definitely a little bit different world than it was.
Yeah, and so I think it was Bruce Lawn. Is that the author of the original report?
Yes. Bruce Lawn, Lahn, is a Chinese immigrant, and back in the early 2000s, he was around 40 years old, and very renowned in the field of genetics already, working at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute at the University of Chicago. And so he was doing his research there, had a team working with him that ended up focusing on the microcephalin gene. And the microcephalin gene is responsible for brain growth. And he became especially intrigued by this gene because some people seem to have an extra piece of genetic material stuck onto that part of the gene. So it's not just like a different sequencing, but some truly extra stuff is how it basically gets described. And not in technical terms, of course, but, in layman's terms. So he studied this and came to certain conclusions with the type of regression analysis they're able to do on genes and populations. And so he, studied all these different populations around the world and tested for this. And ultimately what he came up with was that this was introduced to the human population roughly 37,000 years ago. There's a range there, of course, with things like this, but the midpoint is 37,000 years ago, which of course coincides with when Adam and Eve are said to have arrived. And he talks about how it seems to have a single origin, a single point of origin in the human population. So Adam and Eve basically in these terms counts as single origin, even though it's two people, it's a single source. The MCPH1 variant exhibited positive selection, meaning that it got into the human gene pool quite quickly. And so in the Urantia book, of course, we're learning that Adam and Eve had a mission, which was to go share the genetics with the world. And that's basically what happened, and more or less. And of course, with the stumbles along the way, he identified Mesopotamia as the general origin of this gene variant. And of course, we have from the Urantia book that Adam and Eve showed up there in Mesopotamia off the coast of Syria. And then, of course, were between the Tigris and Euphrates for the second garden. So all of that aligns. There's additional alignment where the path of the new genetic variant, the MCPH1, runs parallel to the general progress of human civilization, and the evidence that he collected indicated that it did not get down into sub-Saharan Africa very much at all. And that's where things got problematic, especially because that aspect of the research raised issues of race that people were very uncomfortable to address. And so we had the irony here where Bruce Lawn came to the United States hoping to enjoy more academic freedom than what was available in China. And his first really big project that he was moving his career forward with just blew up in his face this way. It's sad. It's very sad to say what happened. I mean, he was, planning to apply for patents and, do these things, advance the research that he started. He just had to drop it all. On my travels, I had a chance to meet with him and spoke with him, just the two of us, for about 45 minutes. It was really a wonderful conversation, and he was, very open-minded about everything I had to say, and we were very much on the same page, it seemed, with a lot of our thinking. And then a few years later, I tried to get back in touch with him, and there was just no response at all, and I didn't know about the backlash at that point yet. And so then I started looking things up and found out why he didn't want to have anything to do, certainly, with the conversation anymore. And in fact, one of the things that occurred was Bruce Lawn and the people he worked with especially became very interested in doing reports that showed that this MCPH1 has nothing to do with intelligence. That whatever it does, it definitely doesn't do that. And so they had these rather bogus types of studies, of course, related to that, trying to say that just because it relates to brain growth, the size of the brain isn't going to be a necessary determinant of intelligence, and you can't go off of things like that. And of course, we already knew that. And because we know about computers and how computer technology works and the advances you can make by changing just a little bit, it was really on an intellectual level, it seemed kind of silly to me, and pretty obvious what they were trying to do and why. They were backpedaling, and they wanted to save their careers, and that's how they had to do it, and so they did. So then fast forward to 2019, and the Chinese do some studies where they take the MCPH1 and put it in rhesus monkeys and document that the monkeys become more intelligent when this type of genetic manipulation is done. So in a great stroke of verification for the Urantia Book and irony for human science, we had the Chinese come in at the end and actually verify what Bruce Lawn wasn't able to discuss years earlier. You just can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's really precious. And so you can imagine adding this last little bit of information at the end makes this whole story so much more powerful and interesting than it did back in 2015.
Yeah.
So turns out my first audience with this type of presentation happened to be a Georgian audience. And so most of the presentation, I'm just listening to it being translated into a language I have no relationship to at all. And, I'm wondering what's getting through and what's lost in translation and all of that. But it seemed to, get through pretty well. And I had a good translator show up. Not by accident. I mean, it came through invitations and networking and so forth. But it turns out that he lived in the United States for 40 years. And so he was very conversant with English, and Georgian is still his native language, of course. So he was able, now back in Georgia and living in Georgia again, to step up and step in. And I was hoping that would happen. I had some people lined up to do translations, and they helped at the beginning. And for the easier material, it was easier for them to translate. But it quickly became apparent to me, and I just really hadn't thought it through enough, that just because people have a good understanding of conversational English and have studied English as a second language to that degree that they can pretty fluently maneuver through their day, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've got the vocabulary for these types of presentations related to the Urantia book. And,
Right.
now we're talking tectonic plates and genes and alleles and all of this stuff. It's definitely a challenging type of material to translate effectively.
Yeah, I had a friend. I still haven't watched that the presentation. I had a friend that watched it, and he was explaining to me, like the having to, you give your presentation, then have it be translated, and yeah, I can imagine that would be very difficult to, try to keep the flow of the conversation going while you're waiting for it to be translated, and then you don't understand the language, so you don't know if it's being translated correctly or not.
Right. So I hope at some point to represent all this stuff in English for an English speaking audience. But that's how it worked out this time. So yes, there's more work to be done that way, and it sort of made me wonder if I shouldn't create some new videos for various little aggregations of topics. The Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and Göbekli Tepe reports really bunch together nicely. They build on each other and are thematically related and involve different areas of science. It's a wonderfully cool little group of go-to reports. But there's lots of reports and other things to focus on, and only so much time within any given context. So it seems like because so many years have passed and the work has accumulated, and when I was more active with doing presentations, there wasn't nearly as much. There weren't nearly as many reports and verifications to inspire with and to present about. So I think it's probably time, maybe we'll be able to get after that at some point.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like, just as time goes on, there's just so much more that they just keep finding that just aligns with the Urantia book, and so many different things, even in like astronomy and just, yeah. And I've been trying to make videos, but like you said, there's not enough time to try to keep up. And honestly, that's kind of a motivation for doing this style of a presentation, because making individual videos, sometimes can take months, and a lot of editing and research and all that, and just having a conversation with somebody who already has the knowledge and the understanding is a quicker way to get that information out, I think. And so that's what's kind of motivated me to do some of these type podcast episodes.
Breaking it up into chunks is a good idea. like for instance, with the introduction, half the presentation ends up just being about introducing the Urantia book, which is great, but it creates as many questions as it answers. It's just the nature of the conversation. And so it ends up being this setup that raises all these questions and then focuses on a few very specific things. That's fine, but it does mean that first half can kind of be peeled away.
Right.
And then we're dealing with a significantly different context and way to manage the time and opportunities to present different things for basically different interest areas and audiences that way, and just to be able to get the material out there that way for people who want to ingest it, through a video presentation, and people do enjoy that. And so I hope to feed that interest, because there really is a lot of stuff on the UB the News page, and it can be hard to, or just, take a lot of time, and it can be hard to know how to efficiently work through it. And then you don't really walk away in, 20 or 30 minutes with something that's kind of cohesive and powerful and, congeals and everything, because you've had to spend so much time doing a more in-depth reading of this report or that report. So, yeah, I think we have some opportunities here. And, I just wonder what, how audiences will receive it all today. When I was working on the UB the News reports earlier and there wasn't as much material, it was hard to be as impressive with the work. And things like Göbekli Tepe, for instance, weren't such a cultural issue as much as they are today. And so these things really make a difference. The interpreting the carvings on Gobekli Tepe with a Urantia Book perspective that suggests they had a knowledge of procreation, of sperm and egg and ovaries and all of this. Is definitely a new approach, something that archaeologists are not going to jump to. They say snakes; those are snakes, obviously, right? So this is another good example where, when I first started UB the News, and Göbekli Tepe wasn't one of the first things I got to, so I didn't have an opportunity to show how effective the Urantia Revelation can be when it comes to this type of work, that we really can see things there that other people aren't going to see, that's quite compelling. The whole use of the H symbol at Göbekli Tepe and how that aligns with megalithics in South America, and then also in Africa. The Nubian civilization has artifacts there, ancient architecture with these enormous H's in front of pyramids, right? And then what is it, Pumapinku? Is that how we say it? From South America has those extensive, repetitive, peculiarly crafted H's.
Right.
Right.
What do you think those are?
Chromosomes.
Okay.
Yeah. When you pull in some slides for this talk that we're having right now, you'll find one in the slide presentation that, is the obvious thing, right? We know that we use the H to represent the double helix. We'll get fancy with our modern graphics and show, a double helix twisted. right?
Right.
But then to talk about it, we'll untwist it and talk about specifically the connectors and what they mean. And when you look at it from that perspective and consider that they understood that H to mean the male and female chromosomes coming together, then when you see it nestled between two parentheses, right? You see the chromosomes inside the egg. And then when you see a snake swimming right down to it, you go, oh, the sperm's coming to the egg where the chromosomes come together and male and female are joined. And it becomes the most obvious thing in the world to interpret. Just once one has the willingness to believe that they might have been educated that way and that they were losing, the sophistication of the education, but they still had some basic components that were cherished and became fetishes, essentially. Right. Or sacred markings or whatever you want to call them. But, it's all there to be interpreted. And then you also will see the use of the bull with the horns. And this looks a lot like a uterus with the fallopian tubes. And you'll see other depictions there that, look like the archaeologists will say it looks like the bottom half of a fox. It's got a body and two legs coming down and a tail. And you can tell it's a fox because the bottom of those two legs, there's some extra little lines there for the feet. Or you could say the tail represents a vagina that goes up to a uterus, and off of the uterus are two fallopian tubes, and at the end of the tubes are ovaries. Right?
No.
Like, why would they put half of a fox right there, where the genitals would be on their statue? Doesn't make any particular sense. No. It doesn't come up in any other kind of megalithic artistry or carvings. They're really stretching for an interpretation. But, right around that same design, you have these H's in the parentheses, and you have the snake sperms, swimming towards it, and all this stuff is right there with it.
Right. Well, it makes you wonder too, because it's not, even the Sumerians, they have the pictures of the sun and planets orbiting, and some of them have exactly 8, but how did they know? We didn't even know that planets orbited the sun until the 1600s. How did they know, 6,000 to 8,000 years ago?
And this is a peculiar aspect of human psychology, I guess, because people will look at those ancient Sumerian carvings and see the sun and the planets and go, maybe some kind of alien space beings came here and told them about this stuff. Or, in some kind of mystic, extraordinary way we can't even begin to understand, they understood details about the cosmos that, was somehow lost and then took tens of thousands of years to recover, right? Whatever it is, people see that, they interpret it just like you said as astronomy, cosmology, and then have to go to great lengths to try to explain it. And yet, for some reason, people can't do the same thing on the micro level. We can only do it on the macro level. So why couldn't the alien space beings come here and teach us about biology if they're going to teach us about astronomy?
Right.
Yeah. And shoot, if they're abducting our cows and, abducting people to, get their genes and run all these experiments and everything, you would think that someone in this same crowd of speculators about the unknown and the mysteries of science and the world and human history would just say, well, maybe they knew about biology. But
Yeah.
it seems like nobody ever says that.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping that it'll kind of crack open, if we can create a little buzz, a little fuss about that interpretation. It went over very well, is one of the things, I guess I want to say. Coming out of the presentation, I did get some comments back about, I'll never look at those stones again the same way, right? And it goes for the whole world, that's an important point to remember, is that Göbekli Tepe, when we focus in on that age, it ties us into interesting things from around the world and allows us to ask a new set of questions that, come from what we've already seen with Göbekli and how well that applies. It's all good that way.
Yeah. And I mean, another thing that's just amazing is the fact that it is seen all over the world. Like, you have the same thing being seen in South America as you have in Mesopotamia, and like you said, in Africa, and sometimes even further north. And it's just like all these different cultures and people separated by vast distances. Before planes and trains and all this technology, and they're doing the same thing. It's obviously there was some kind of shared knowledge or something that was passed down for a long period of time, that they would have known these things, or like you said, beings coming and giving them this information. And I mean, otherwise there's not any other explanations for it.
Well, it's one of those things that, because it's so mysterious, of course people love to make things up and develop a theory, because when things are incredibly difficult to explain, then everyone gets to become an expert more easily. Right? You don't have this baseline consensus as much, and there's just a lot of room to jump in and speculate with a mystery. The Urantia book actually takes a lot of the mystery out of it. Maybe it's no fun that way.
Well, I
too
mean,
many
the
answers.
Urantia book leaves plenty of mysteries, though.
I think so too, but it's interesting to think about. And there's a whole, development of the archaeology in that part of the world that's really coming our way as Urantia book students. Have you heard about the megalithic architecture in the, like, not the bottom, but like 80 plus feet below the surface of Lake Van? Have you heard about this?
I believe I have heard about it, but I haven't looked into it too much.
This is really a stunning discovery, because the nature of the megalithic architecture that I've seen in photos that are readily available and can pull one up and show people, it's like this tower that comes out. It's round, and the stones are cut perfectly so no mortar is needed, and some of them on the top are decorated a bit. And so you've got a structure that's more sophisticated, in its architecture that way than Göbekli Tepe. And they say it's deeper than any megalithic architecture that is submerged. We have some of this along shorelines, of course, and it's easy enough to understand that the shoreline has changed over time, and that's why it's under the water. But Lake Van, as I've come to appreciate, and I didn't understand this before, one of the reasons it's such a huge lake is that it used to have an outlet. And then about 12,000 years ago, there was a huge volcanic eruption that closed the outlet. So it got flooded,
Right. Yeah.
right?
The water level would go up. Yeah.
And this means that they're able to date this architecture as at least as old as the volcanic eruption.
Wow.
Is
So at least
basically,
12,000 years old, huh?
yeah, it puts you in that kind of range, and makes you wonder how far it really goes back. I suppose it might have taken a little time before it got totally submerged or whatever. It's hard to say, how quickly it arose, how close it was to the shore, at the time all of that occurred. But from what they've said, you know, it looks like, and as deep as it is, of course, because with a lake, it's going to spread out. As the water gets higher, it's going to be harder for it to raise a foot because you're going to be dealing with a little bit more land, a little bit more coverage, with every foot. But so it's a really amazing area that we'll just have to keep tabs on and see what goes with it. Of course, exploring things underwater is challenging, but in this case, it's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, didn't you say that you found some interesting archaeology in Georgia?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be invited on a private tour of an archaeological site and museum that isn't open to the public yet. They've been working on it for about 4 years. This is in relationship to having been doing some road construction, and an excavator, dug into something old. And they've got an area that apparently has various types of artifacts from a wide range of time periods, even dating back to pre-human. So they were mainly focused on an area that was about 2,500 to 3,000 years old. And so a lot of the things in the museum and also the excavations were, related to that time period. And so that was very interesting, and generally confirmatory in some ways of, Urantia Book history, but nothing in particular. I think the real contribution would be if they would dig down deeper, especially in the areas where there's mining. I think there may be ways to come up with some very interesting understandings about the history of mining in particular, and that Georgia would be especially useful that way to corroborating information in the revelation. I learned while I was there, and I have to now review the history of fairy tales related to Golden Fleece. But I came to learn that in Georgia, they have these stories about how you used to be able to put lambskin, sheepskin, in the streams, and the gold would collect in the hairs. And
wow.
This is where the idea of golden fleece came from. It was an actual way of mining gold. I had no idea.
Huh. Huh.
Now I'm really curious, what does all this mean? I have no idea.
Yeah. I mean, I've done some gold prospecting myself, and using like a sluice box with it's got the fine mesh and stuff like that. That'd be interesting to incorporate that and see what happens. I mean, I could imagine. I mean, yeah. I mean, it makes sense.
They have some interesting stories in Georgia.
Yeah,
they really do. So, any rate, there's I hope to get back and maybe for an extended stay, maybe just for a couple months, maybe a few years, maybe live there. I don't know. it's an interesting place, but very challenging when also they don't speak English.
Yeah.
All right. So, or a lot of them don't. A lot of the people my age, right? The younger people speak English. And so it's not that they aren't culturally moving in that direction. It's that it's been developing in such a way that those who really need it and value it the most have already been being brought up with it.
Yeah, because I think you mentioned to me that, if you did do an extended stay there, one of the things you were considering was teaching English, right?
Right, right. Yeah, I figured that would be a good way to meet people. People who definitely wanted to cross the language barrier, and it was important to them in some kind of way, or my kind of people.
Right, yeah.
But it may mean like having to really build my own clientele and maybe giving free English lessons based on teaching from the life and teachings of Jesus would be an interesting way to learn the language.
There you go.
Yeah. Maybe that's written on a level that you could start with. That's been one of the ideas I've been teasing up. I don't know if it's just idealistic fantasy or might, have some reality.
It sounds like a good idea to me, and I guess you never know unless you try. Yeah.
It would be interesting to run some experiments that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. It would be an interesting project. That would be something that really could be orchestrated in advance. If I got this certification and then, put out the word and, ran some courses for a couple months, some intensive courses that met daily, 5 days a week or something like that. It could really give people a boost in their English, and it was offered for free, and it give them a wonderful experience of the Urantia book. And who knows, what can come out of something like that. It's
in Georgia. What's the language there? Is it just the Georgian language, or is it?
Yes.
Georgian?
Yes.
And so is there a Georgian translation of the Urantia book?
Marina is working on that. She's up to paper like 68 or something. She's coming right along. She's gotten through the most challenging ones. I mean, she's done some work in the Jesus section, little bits and pieces, I understand, but she's mainly been working through it from beginning to end. So she's definitely got the hardest part completed at this point, for the most part. I mean, there'll be some papers like, around the last papers.
The 119.
The last papers of part 3 get a little dense theologically.
Yeah.
You get what is it? The triodities, things like this, right? So, yeah. I have a little work there before it gets to be real playtime with the Jesus section. That should be, just go very smoothly and be a wonderful new experience of translating after having done everything else, I would imagine.
Yeah.
I feel like just an enormous amount of weight is taken off, and and she'll have so much more facility with the whole process of translating by the time she gets to the Jesus section, having done all the hard work already.
I was thinking if you did go over there and teach English, and if there wasn't a translation going on, then maybe you can work on that as part of what you're doing. It might be a way to actually even get secure funding, because I know that they do some funding for that kind of the translations and stuff. So
yeah, that's an interesting idea. Since she will be coming up on the Jesus papers, maybe there's some way to integrate all of it and raise some funds for a project like that. which would be important,
Yeah.
it would be probably the necessary thing. It's one thing to, try and go over there and live and create a lifestyle, but if, just going over there for a limited period of time, a couple of months or something, that's different.
Yeah.
That's different. So, yeah, I wonder what the future holds that way. Georgia seems to be a very interesting place to run this type of experiment. It's so peculiar regarding the English language because of its more recent, in the last several decades, by that I mean more recent relationship to Russia. And in the turn of events, they developed quite a negative attitude towards the Russians. And the Russians come to Georgia a lot as tourists, and they buy a lot of Georgian wine. So there's still a lot of commerce going on. And Russians will try to hide their Russian identity by speaking English. So if I don't say, "Do you speak English? I'm from America," the first thought will be, "I'm another Russian trying to hide it."
Oh, wow.
It is
That's
very
interesting.
peculiar. It's a really weird kind of head trip to experience people this way, where their, first reaction is.
And so what's their like the general thought of Americans?
Well, this is where I think it depends what segment of the population you're talking to a lot. Is going to make the difference. It's going to make a lot of difference. So if you're talking to younger people, they're probably more open-minded about America. They probably, on a percentage basis, were the ones more inclined to open Georgia to the EU and to Western influences, and were more aligned with Ukraine and all of that stuff. Then the older population, less so. You're going to have a more conservative, more traditional population that way. And so you've got that type of issue. And then on top of it, you've got both Ukrainians and Russian young people immigrating to Georgia to escape the war. So Georgia actually becomes a place where young people from both sides are showing up trying to do all kinds of young people tech stuff, to somehow make a living in Tbilisi. So I've heard that they've gotten like 300,000 people this way, which in a country that's like 4.3 million and a city that's like 1.3 million or something, these are big numbers, big percentages, relative to their population. And, it is one of these countries where like they run tourists through the country. I think it's like a factor of 3 times their population or something. Like they get about 12 million tourists a year, something like that. So a lot of those are Russian, but a lot of those are also European. One of the things that caught me by surprise was I was seeing all these cars on the road. It made me feel like I was in Boston or San Francisco or something, like some American, like it just didn't seem like I traveled halfway around the world. And then I came to learn that Georgia has become a great place to sell cars if you're in Europe, and the secondhand market for cars is better in Georgia than it is locally, right? So I understood that a bit once it was said out loud. I could see why there would be this, migration of vehicles into the country, and I saw it all over the streets of Tbilisi. And so it gives you a sense of the sort of cultural currents that go on that are economic, they're cultural, political, of course. And you have the differences between the city life and the country life is going to tend to be more liberal and conservative. So like the big shopping mall in Tbilisi near Liberty Square is just filled with stores that are like for rich Westerners, like jewelry stores and clothing stores, and you would just think you're in Europe or something. And all kinds of American products, from Snickers to Coca-Colas to, all this type of stuff going on. So there's a lot of cross-cultural influences. They are and always have been, right at the crossroads of human civilization and the developments of it. It's very interesting the way those Caucasus mountains, being so steep and formidable and stretching across that narrow strip of land between the Black Sea and the Caspian, creates a situation where on the one hand, you've got a population that has a lot of identification with cultures to the north, but at the same time, they're at the southern boundary of it all and basically got there and got to be that way because they were the people who would head up into the mountains when things got violent. And, that's what peaceful people will do, is they'll head up into the mountains because it's challenging and get away from all the ruckus. Right?
Yep.
So they've been playing that game in Georgia for eons. Right? It's very distinct that way, that the peaceful influences of the Adamites, if they weren't going to go east or west or south, they were going to get stuck there at the Caucasus, making the best of it and heading up into the hills when things get rough.
Yeah.
Come back down when you can. Right? And man, to go from sea level to 17,000 feet in a country that's smaller than South Carolina.
Oh, wow.
It's extraordinary to see that, to look across out from Tbilisi and get up on these hills and, see the mountains in the distance covered with snow and just go, wow.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I live in the Rocky Mountains, so I'm very familiar with mountainous areas, but we don't have any mountains that go into that range. 17,000 feet that's a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. So they've got a lot going on. They've got a lot of history. I'd love to get back. We'll see how it works out and when.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that story with us. It's really, really interesting. I know we wanted to talk about a couple other things. I did have one question. I wanted to go back to Bruce Lawn again. You said that you got to sit down with him for 45 minutes. I assume that was in person, right?
Yes, in person.
Yeah. How did that go, and what did you guys talk about?
Well, I introduced him to the work that I was doing, and we just talked about basically the benefits of hybridization and finding positive ways to incentivize it. Our conversation focused on the general recognition and respect for the scientific principles at play regarding genetics and that human beings are different. And then asking ourselves as spiritual people, as children of God, okay, how do we manage this in a way that's peaceful? What can we do to incentivize the behavior patterns we want to see and so that was the general thread of it, because as you're well aware, most people are who've engaged this type of conversation. As soon as it comes up and the issue of eugenics and racial differences comes up, people presume that the outcome is some violent, horrible, genocidal type of, problem, and that's where it leads to, and that's where it always leads to, and it only can lead to that, and
Right.
on it goes. And of course, this is just wrong-headed thinking and terribly problematic, because these issues exist within a race, within a type. There's going to be variations, and if we don't manage ourselves wisely, we have problems. So the interracial aspect is just adding to what's always going to be a real human issue. And so, I don't know what it's going to take eventually for people to just realize that we've been promoting negative eugenic lifestyles, and we need to promote positive eugenic lifestyles. I mean, it's not as though this stuff doesn't happen one way or the other. All of our nonviolent social policies tend to have an impact on how well families can develop and where and how, and it's always going on. But we don't necessarily have conversations that are intelligent and wise and specific and direct about it, and create a human gene pool project that gets everyone on board, because it is a hybridization project. It does fundamentally respect genetic differences and view them as God's creative hand in our collective destiny. I mean, when we talk about it in a true intelligent design, faith-based context, conversation unfolds quite beautifully. Where there's going to be compassion for everyone, and something, for everyone to relate to in a positive way, who is willing to embrace all of humanity as their family and wants, the family project to move forward.
Right.
This is something where, we have all kinds of little analogies or whatever I could bring up, but I just don't want to make the wisdom cliche that way or something. These are challenging aspects of life, but we have to get down to it eventually, or if we don't, we pay the price, have consequences for it. So, I think ultimately this is why it's challenging for the Urantia community to use something like the Adam and Eve report and Göbekli Tepe, Garden of Eden report. Even though they're so impressive, they lead directly into a discussion of these types of issues. And, we have problems with that conversation internally. We have problems with it externally. We have problems. It's really hard. And it hasn't been getting easier. Exactly. It's not.
No, it seems like it's been getting harder.
Yeah, it seems to be getting harder, not easier. So I don't know what to say about that, other than we just got to keep carrying on and trust the revelation and work with it as best we can, and with respect to its qualities, and to trust that this guidance will bring humanity together. That's what it's here for, and caring and intelligent people can see that, and I think we have to trust the process, not be afraid of it, and just keep on being willing to face all the challenges of it. There are good answers and good explanations and good reasons to talk openly and with love and compassion and wisdom about how to move ourselves forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like, that's what the world needs is a lot of these tough conversations that need to be had by the people who have that compassion and love and wisdom and who are willing to actually sit down and have that conversation peacefully. Instead you just see, unfortunately, in the media and in social media, and people just up in arms over the littlest thing, and then you can see clearly that they're arguing, and you can see both sides, like neither side even understands what they're really even arguing about. They're just mad, and you see that so much, and it's disheartening. But yeah, it would be nice if some of those conversations could be had, and we can get some wise leadership in our world to spearhead that, because it is needed. So I did have another question. Oh, you had mentioned the tonal and non-tonal languages, cultural development, and other genetic markers.
Yes, this is a fun topic to tease out a bit, especially as it relates to Georgian and the nature of the Georgian language. So, a tonal language is when you have to put a certain inflection, sort of a particular like emotive content on a syllable in order to say it, correctly, in order to give it its meaning. And a non-tonal language is one in which you can just say the word flat with or without emotion, or with a variety of emotional inflections. So generally speaking, it's considered that the non-tonal language is the more advanced type of language. It's the one that's liberated language to allow for any type of emotional inflection to be put on the meaning of the word. Okay? So this tracks with the history of Adam and Eve's descendants and the development of language and an alphabet and all this stuff on our planet. And so one of the things that's interesting about this is that we can appreciate that the genetics are distinct from language and culture. So a tonal language like Chinese, if you take someone who's Chinese and raise them in the United States, they'll speak English just fine. And vice versa. You take a baby from the United States and raise them Chinese, they'll learn to speak a tonal language just fine. So it develops that sometimes you can then have this diversification of the genetics from the evolution of linguistic culture towards a non-tonal language. And the Georgian language is more on the tonal side of it. There'll be like different kinds of K sounds and like TS sounds depending on how hard you hit it. And I noticed that their alphabet had similarities to the Hebrew alphabet. And their language has similarities to the Russian language in the sense that they don't use vowels as much. You'll get more consonants in a row before you hit a vowel in there. And I was noticing with all of this, then because I started to study Georgian, that like they don't have the hard I sound. They don't say sky, they would say ski. it just goes to that E sound. And similarly with it. And it occurred to me how it's interesting because Adam and Eve's culture brought musicality to humanity. And its trajectory through humanity, provided this. And vowels are what we harmonize with. And so you might think that the language would develop with more vowel sounds if it's developing musically, because that gives you more to work with. It's like having more instruments in your orchestra, more vowel sounds to harmonize around, and makes the language beautiful that way. But yeah, we've got these cultural differences and things that happened, and Georgia's sitting right in the middle of it, and you get towards to the east and the Orient, then you get more of this predominant tonal type of language. And of course, the Andites mated with the Blue Man, so we have this Indo-European, thing going on that became culturally dominant. And so it's just very interesting to appreciate, I think, what's going on with all of this stuff, and try to, just get some perspective on it. But yes, Georgia has its own language. It tends to be on the tonal side of things. And yeah, it's challenging that way. It's like trying to learn Russian or something. But all the symbols are different. Like they've got their own letters. Everything's just different. So you really have to start over. And I'm not sure what your question was anymore. Oh, you're asking about tonal and non-tonal languages and how that related to Adam and Eve's genetics. And so we were talking about how their genetics created a course for human culture that developed the non-tonal language, the language that allows you to sing more vowels and have all those cool kind of musical things, versus the tonal language. And then there are also some other genetic studies, I think, based off the Y chromosome that, had a similar track as this microcephalin allele, the MCPH1. So, there's a little bundle of genetic research that all kind of fits together and ties in with anthropological considerations as well, cultural development and languages and everything. One of the things I learned recently when I was studying all of this and putting together a presentation on etymology for the Urantia Foundation Spotlight series was the word Aryan meant something different back when the Urantia book was written and provided to us. I won't say published, because we had a real shift in world culture and politics, but you'll see why this is important. So Aryan used to mean this northern India, Persian up into Europe. What we now today call Proto-Indo-European, right?
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that these were synonymous back in the 1930s, when the Urantia book was put in. And so when it's using the word Aryan, we need to think about it as Proto-Indo-European. But today, Aryan just means they've taken off the European part of it. It's like Proto-Indian, but basically it's like Persian Indian, right? So they have no longer acknowledged the European aspect of Aryan in the meaning of the word. And so this, I think, has definitely to do with the Second World War and efforts to disconnect, that word from the genetics and the culture and the development of everything. And so I can see why it happened, but it can become confusing sometimes when you're reading the Urantia Revelation. If you don't keep that in mind, it won't make as much sense, because it did used to mean Proto-Indo-European.
Yeah. And I have heard a lot of people suggest too that, having a dictionary from, the mid 1930s is always handy when reading the Urantia book, and in doing my research, I always, if I come across a term and I'm just like, this doesn't really sound like it fits with today's meaning, then I'll always go back and look it up in the 1930s or 1920s and see what it meant back then in the times where this was actually written, because meanings do change, and that's a really interesting thing, how much meanings can change, especially on major events like World War II. Changed a lot of meanings on a lot of different words. You see that with just so many words, like sometimes just a regular normal word, and then it gets some kind of negative connotation onto it, and then that word just becomes a bad word or a stigma to even bring up, and and so meanings and definitions and words have to change and evolve, and so that's very difficult with something like the Urantia papers being written in text like it is. You have to keep it the way that it is. You can't change any of those words, even though the meanings might change later on down the road, because then you're going to be messing with the overall message of it. And then there has been people that have tried to change the Urantia book, like update it with more modern terms and words, and that's never went well that I've seen.
I think this issue with Aryan is a case in point where I'm not sure we've done ourselves any favors by changing the definition. If we wanted a term that excluded the European from the Indo-Persian, we could make up a new term for that. We don't have to take one that's already in usage that people have been writing and putting into their documents for decades, and then mess it all up by giving it a new definition. So I think that's one of the things we also have to watch out for, is that evolution is not always positive. Sometimes it's a negative evolution, a retrogression, and we lose things.
Yeah, like Pluto as being a planet.
There you go. Yes, and Pluto is no longer a planet.
Yeah,
it's rough. It's rough out there.
Yeah, that was a hard one.
There's this peculiar backstory to it as well, in terms of when they had the vote and how a lot of people had already left the meeting. Have you heard about this?
Yeah. It was like I think they said 2/3 of the people that attended this meeting had already left by the time they decided to have this vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have any other questions on your list there?
I think that about covers it, and I think we kind of got through a lot here. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add, or?
No, just thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to download some ideas, share some thoughts, raise some questions, and hopefully make some plans for the future. I think we covered all kinds of different things here, and I look forward to more talks, and let's see what we can focus on to keep it interesting and congealed with various topics. All for it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being here, and I really enjoyed hearing about Georgia. That was really interesting. I'm really interested in other cultures. I'm kind of a homebody, I guess. I don't get out much, so when I get to hear stories about other people's travels and stuff, it's a lot of fun. So
It's rough traveling to Georgia. I will say
yeah,
that.
I bet.
It's like 26 hours of travel time,
Oh yeah,
and
jeez.
that's rough. It
Yeah, I
just
don't think
really
I could
is.
handle
Yeah.
that.
It's the way it works out with the
Yeah,
flight schedules and everything, and the length of the flights just anyways. I mean, you've got about 8.5 hours to get over to Munich, and then another 4 hours to get down to Georgia. So that gives you no time between flights and assumes like you're already in New York or something, right? So I've got
yeah,
to get out of the Louisville airport and get to the airport and then fly somewhere and switch planes. It takes 3 flights to get there, and with the way they run the red eyes for some of these longer flights, it just gives you very long layover times.
yeah.
So that's what kind of ends up kicking your butt. I think if I go back, I'll try real hard to find some way to have like a day or two in Europe or whatever, like the stopover city is.
Yeah.
Maybe just find a little bit slower way to make my way out there so that the travel isn't so rough.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's a good
yeah.
idea. Yeah.
So,
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, and it's been a pleasure having you.
thanks, Josh.
All
Okay, take
right.
care.
You take
Bye
care.
bye. God
Bye.
bless.